So hi, welcome to End Credit Reviews. This is Tyler from End Credit Reviews.
And Steven Lawson, or the Big Steve on Instagram.
Yes, and 10 years ago this year, or at least in certain film festivals, the movie It Follows was released. Even though it wouldn't be until 2015 that it was released to the public, I felt like it'd be a good time to do a retrospect on It Follows, mainly because of the fact that there was a horror movie with the lead star of this movie who's also in it called Longlegs that's coming out pretty soon. And Steve and I enjoyed this horror movie a lot. So the plot to It Follows is basically about this demon that is sexually transmitted, and it's basically like the Terminator, where it just goes to the next person to kill them, and the victim is the only one who can really see this demon. I mean, he can interact and bump into other people or attack other people if it wants to, but it's mainly this shape-shifting demon. So I'm just gonna let you take it from there, Steven. So what do you think of It Follows?
Well, one thing I just want to add real quick was the way you described Longlegs made it sound like that might be the name of the actress. Her name is Longlegs.
Oh no.
No, but yeah, I hear you, and that's a pretty good rough summary.
I just want to respond to that.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
No, I'm not a late guy, and I wasn't trying to do some kind of like, oh yeah, I'm hitting on the lead actors or whatever. I'm not saying that at all. That's literally what the name of the movie is.
Yeah, just imagining Showgirls, you know.
I was just thinking of the parody of that. It'd be called Short Legs, where it's just like a little cat like running, or like a short person. Hey, wait up! I got short legs. Like, yeah, just make it a comedy, like just a parody of this movie. Would be pretty funny to see. If Mad TV was still around, that'd be perfect. Which I always thought was better than SNL, but I digress.
Very true.
So I'll just let Steven get back to it.
Very true. Yes, so it follows as a very interesting horror film that kind of exists in an ambiguous time, and yeah, you can read several themes into it, but obviously, as Tyler was describing, with the main theme being a sexually transmitted demon, that it's basically a fight for survival through the act of procreation, but it kind of plays on the trope of basically the kids that are irresponsible and have unprotected sex get murdered. You know, it's kind of playing on that convention directly, but it does a lot of interesting things in the story, and has really compelling stakes throughout that I think are very good. Revisiting the film recently, I do think we've been in such a horror renaissance that it's kind of hard to remember or appreciate some of the gemstones and the milestones that have been leading up to it. And this, I feel, was like one of the earlier ones. There have always been a good horror movie here or there, but It Follows to me was very much, I associate even before The Witch and Hereditary, all these Ari Aster and A24 movies, a early contender that really seemed to be a pioneer on that smaller budget, but not, too small, horror films that can be taken more seriously. And I do think it is deservedly so. There are some good performances throughout, and I can see where, because I've heard from people that weren't so nuts about it, that they thought the pacing in the middle was a little slow, which I can understand. I definitely think certain horror films in recent years have had a better sense of overall pacing and tension that seems to wind up from beginning to end. But this has it has a pacing that's like a chase, where you run off because they literally are running away from this thing that is just walking at them, invisible, across the earth. And I think it's appropriate in that sense to convey this sort of just moments of calm before moments of absolute terror.
Oh yeah.
And I really like, I'm not sure if we'll go into spoiler segments or not, but I really like the ambiguity of the ending. I think that is a classic element of horror films that should be here to stay, because that's part of what makes horror so great, is the uncertainty, the unknown. But yeah, I overall think this is a great film. Micah Monroe, I believe, is the main actress's name. She does a
Mm-hmm.
great job. And this is definitely a good horror milestone that should be appreciated for kind of starting that train of the A24 slow burn horror goodness.
All right, so before I kind of respond to what you're talking about the movie in terms of its themes and everything else with it, I wanted to give a little bit of story time with this. So, years ago, when they were filming this movie around our hometown called At Any Price, one of the people that was there was Mike Monroe. That was her first movie, or at least one of her first movies she was in. And the thing was that I was at the Sycamore Speedway where a lot of the main cast was there, and I was there with my mom and a cousin of mine came with too. And my cousin and I decided to wander around to kind of look around to see, if we can find. And we happened to run to Micah Monroe, and we struck up a conversation. And I was like, "Yeah, I just really love seeing all this movie stuff and that sort of deal." And she was very nice, very down to earth, very open, nice conversationalist. I forget exactly what we said. Then I kind of forgot about her for a while until this movie came out, and then she was in that Independence Day Resurgence movie. And I remember I looked at Steven when that trailer was playing, and I that's when I realized it. And I looked at Steven. I told him that I actually met her, and I remember you had this like mouthful of popcorn and your jaw dropped when you looked at me. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
what? Because I know you really like this actress a lot.
Yeah, she's I like her very much. Yes. So
Yeah, I think she was about our age. But yeah, the thing is, it's just kind of weird to know that I actually met this actress in person before she became somewhat famous. And it's interesting to know that there are certain actresses who make it big, or at least one of their first movies is a horror movie. Because we look at, let's say, Johnny Depp, one of his first movies was Nightmare on Elm Street. With Jennifer Aniston, one of her first movies was Leprechaun. And more recent example, Anya Taylor-Joy, one of the first movies she was in was The Witch. And of course, she's a big actress now, so it seems like a lot of actors or actresses that make it big, one of their earliest movies is a horror movie, which is something that people have pointed out, and that's interesting to note. And typically, there's a lot of horror movies because they're typically cheap to make, and that way there's a lot more of them because they tend to be profitable in that regard.
I also think that we should have a episode kind of going into like the resurgence of horror, why it particularly seems to be successful now. I've got my own theories, and I'd be curious to hear yours. But yeah, no, that is a super cool story, and I still would love to meet that actress, her or Anya Taylor Joy at some point, just for their amazing roles. But in the horror films, to be clear, not necessarily Independence Day Resurgence, but yeah. It's
I mean, I like to see him get work, of course.
Oh sure, absolutely.
Yeah, or even just like a casual like party or get together or something, just to know him. That would be fun to see as well. Like maybe ask him about like projects here and there and that sort of deal.
Yeah, he's gonna put his number on screen for you. May want to watch.
No, not for Anya because she's married and I respect marriage.
Fair.
All right, but anyway, so while I was getting to that, kind of segues into responding to what you were saying earlier. Was that I mean, yes, on the surface, it is about sexually transmitted diseases, and there's a lot more to that. People have pointed out how the story itself is about someone going through adolescence and maturing into adulthood because we kind of have this carefree attitude that fairy tale kind of quality this movie does have with the main character. How there's a moment where she's like in the pool and seeing these younger boys spying on her in her bikini and that, but she doesn't mind it. She just thinks it's flattery or whatever, and she knows that there's like this bug in this pool that she kind of casually dismisses in that, and that kind of comes back around towards the climax of the movie, when it comes to the demon creature in this giant pool, without trying to spoil the movie or without too much context to spoil it, but you get what I'm meaning if you've seen the movie. And yeah, I do think that people talk about where are the parents at, and I think that's kind of the point of the movie, is this fairy tale thing where these people are maturing into adults, and the moment where they're walking through like Detroit where it's like run down, that just gets more and more depressing. You kind of see the color palette kind of become a little bit more stark in contrast compared to a little bit more of the brighter colors in the beginning of the movie. And what I kind of personally take away from this movie, and why I think not only is it, in my opinion, the best horror movie of the 2010s, but also a movie that is still relevant today, is that the movie itself is really about hookup culture. Because in the 2010s, you started to see the rise of dating apps such as mainly Tinder and amongst other ones. And there's hookup culture really became a thing where people were like, I'm just gonna go with this random person here and that for like maybe one night stand or just some fling. And that's a terrible thing for young people to do in their 20s because they should really find a meaningful relationship. So it was really nice at the end when she does go with this one guy that she actually has feelings for and he has feelings for her as well. And they actually have, a moment of sex when they think that everything's all fine. And it shows like you should find a meaningful relationship. It shouldn't just be for a sexual thrill or just because, oh, they look good or whatever. I feel like you should find someone that you're compatible with and will just give you joy, not really necessarily find pleasure, but just joy is more of a healthier, more fulfilling and constructive feeling to have than just pleasure that becomes very addictive.
Yeah, I can definitely sympathize with a lot of that. As I've viewed it more times, I definitely think there is the sort of hookup culture and the metaphor of accountability in this entity. But I also heard a very interesting take recently. I'm not sure I completely agree with this, but someone said that the overall, even more than that, narrative is basically the adolescents warding off the fear of death through sex and basically impulses. And while I can see some truth in that, I think there would be a much more compelling case if, like, I don't know, an actual child had been brought into the world in the story, but spoilers, that doesn't happen. So I think it's definitely, while there could be some small element of that, it's definitely more in the act of just transactional relationships. And also, I will say, not to stereotype people, but they do, although this is set in an ambiguous time where it looks like it could be the 80s or the 90s, but there's a girl using a tablet thing that looks like it could be from the future from now. Mm-hmm. There are just certain things that don't seem to enmesh except for the timeless fears of that existential dread. And I do think that
It's okay.
yeah, it exemplifies a lot of the. I'm gonna need a break. I totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So this movie was directed by David Robert Mitchell. Now, I don't know if you've seen his later movie called Under the Silver Lake that starred Andrew Garfield. And the thing is that I didn't see this movie when it initially came out. And it wasn't until around the lockdowns happened that I finally got around to watching it. And the thing is with that movie is that the reason why I think It Follows works so much better is that it definitely has some meaning and other kind of philosophical things, what have you. But I feel like the problem with Under the Silver Lake is that it's similar to It Follows in that regard, except I think it just tried to tell too much where it becomes a little bit messy and maybe not the easiest movie to follow. But the thing, no pun intended, but. And the thing is, I will admit about Under the Silver Lake is that it's one of those rare movies that has been made in the past 15 years or so where even though I don't love the movie, it has lived rent-free in my head throughout the years because I just kind of think about this movie from time to time about what the meaning was for the movie and various artistic choices made for it. So in a way I would recommend the movie just because it's such an interesting, unique movie. And it's nice to know this guy is directing another movie later on called Flowerville Street. I believe that's what it's called. It's actually his most expensive movie with Anne Hathaway is in it, and I think it's around 85 million or something like that. And I also heard that they're finally developing a sequel or maybe a prequel called They Follow. So I've heard a while back they were developing maybe a prequel explain the origin of this demon creature. And speaking of, I really like the fact that this demon creature kind of shapeshifts. Sometimes it's like past victims or people that maybe the victim kind of knows personally. in ways, but it's also very blunt. Like it doesn't really care. It's not trying to be like sneaky. It's just like doesn't really care. It's just that's how like life and reality tends to be. I guess you can kind of see it that way. And then there's one moment where I know it's for artistic and kind of the dramatic value of basically this tall naked character is like standing on the roof when they're leaving. And I know logically that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's supposed to be constantly following the character, but it really shows how people try to run away from their problems without trying to confront them. And the only way to really solve your problems is to confront it head on, which I feel like was a good part of the story that made sense, but also it was a nice kind of lesson for the audience to see.
That is very true. And the other thing I was going to say was that getting back to kind of just the central characters in the story, as Tyler was saying, the adults are not around, so it's all on them. It's all on the teens and their development cognitively and this traumatic experience. But also we see, and not to place judgment, but there's kind of some trashy behaviors of, that they sit around, they're kind of lazy, they smoke, they run to the gas station, they're hooking up. It's very juvenile, like we were getting about earlier. And so I definitely, I think they did a good job with the world building in such a strange, ambiguous way that also makes it kind of timeless. Also, I'm not entirely familiar on the top of my head with the horror films in the background. When a horror film has horror films in it, that usually is a significant factor of the theme and what the director is trying to go for. But I recall these were more vaguely just a creature feature that was going on in the background. So I definitely really enjoyed this film, and I'm very curious. I'm not sure if They Follow is going to just be like a shameless cash grab as most things are these days, but assuming it's not, I would be very curious to see more in this universe that is kind of set ambiguously, but based along this theme, reveals more about the monster or monsters, as it may be sounding like. And I've also not seen either of his other two films, but this was a great first one to really get him started for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would recommend Under the Silver Lake in some way. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that movie. It's a very interesting flick that is shot around. It's of course Silver Lake is around the L.A. area, but also you were mentioning about a monster that's sexual and that preys upon women, which is ironic because the movie was distributed by the Weinstein Company.
That is ironic. Yes.
And some people theorize that some of the themes of Under the Silver Lake was influenced by the news of that and the fact that the Weinstein Company did distribute his previous movies, so maybe that kind of influenced what he did with his next movie, Under the Silver Lake, in ways. So anyway, Stephen, what would you give It Follows?
I would give this movie... I honestly can't remember what we gave it the first time because it's been about a decade, but I think as time has gone on, I've settled in a bit more with the pacing may not be as ideal, but it overall is still great, and it is kind of a forebearer of a lot of the contemporary horror that we're now seeing. So it was a very important piece of horror cinema in the contemporary American context, at least. And so I think it gets a lot of brownie points for that. Overall, I would say this film deserves somewhere about an 82 to an 84%. It's not perfect, but it is remarkably good thematically. It is still relevant and probably will remain timeless, as the best films do. And I definitely think, especially around Halloween, it deserves a watch because it's its 10th anniversary. So definitely appreciate it, and appreciate where good horror cinema has kind of blossomed from.
Okay, so I definitely agree with saying that it's definitely a very well made horror movie. And yeah, I would say that It Follows is my favorite horror movie of the 2010s. I definitely liked movies like The Witch and Hereditary are also runners up for some of my other favorite horror movies of the 2010s. Personally, I think Get Out is the most overrated horror movie of the 2010s. But I digress from that. And the thing is, what I like about this movie too. It reminds me, in a way, it's kind of like how people say the Terminator is basically a slasher movie, but with science fiction and a guy using guns instead of knives. In a way, It Follows is kind of like the more literal and more artistic version of the Terminator. In a way, except you don't really know a bunch of the backstory of the demon creature thing that keeps following around these victims. But yeah, I agree too with the pacing. Maybe not be the most ideal or the best, but I've grown to like this movie and appreciate it more throughout the years. And the various ways that you can kind of view this movie, which is very objective, it's kind of an open book and how you want to view it, whether on the surface or more philosophical or whatever. But for me, It Follows is really a well-made horror movie. It's one I'm really happy we saw it in theaters when it came out. I'm really happy you brought this to my attention, and I'm just really happy I saw it on the big screen when it came out. And yeah, I definitely would give this a very high recommendation. On A to an F scale, I would give It Follows an A minus.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, mentioning the objective thing, it's weird how there are objective elements, but such subjective interpretations. But on the other hand, I think the best mysteries and horror, um, which I think are often related, do have some significant element of that. And a lot of times, especially in lesser done films or genres, you can brush that off as, oh, plot holes or, things like that. But especially in the context of horror and mysteries, it's very important to have these sort of lingering existential or like, even if it isn't, super highbrow themed like this film is, or other examples from the past, The Exorcist or something, it should still have that sort of psychological effect on you that makes you just that little bit more nervous in the dark, just that little bit more like you're more aware of your surroundings, and you know that there's no rational reason to feel that way, but it somehow stimulates something in your brain that just makes you that much more aware and also makes you reflect on your life. And this film definitely has that effect on me and I think a lot of other people. So
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather watch a more of a highbrow or artistic horror movie like this than those generic like popcorn horror movies where it's all about the jump scares and whatever.
true.
But the thing is, I like about this one, it takes its time with it. It really does. You could argue maybe slow burner, but I'd rather have that where it's focusing more on its story and its characters and other artistic aspects than just being a bunch of cheap jump scare with the cliched sound effects. You know what I'm talking about.
Agreed
Those
completely.
kind.
Like
But
the Five Nights at Freddy games or something.
okay, I never played those, by the way. But anyway, this is Tyler from Anchor Reviews,
And Stephen Lawson, or the Big Steve.
and we hope you enjoyed this video that we made, and we hope to make a lot more in the future. Please like and subscribe.
And like this film, be sure, you being the it in this case, to follow us.
That's right.